Hi, I'm DV, and today I'm going to be talking about Pacman frogs. So these are easily one of the most common frogs in the pet trade, probably second only to White's tree frogs as far as popularity goes. You'll see them at any major chain pet store, and you'll typically see two species. You'll either see Cranwelly, which is what Trevor here is, or an ornate Pacman frog. And the main difference between them is ornates get a little bit bigger, maybe an inch or so longer at adulthood, and they keep their coloration into adulthood. So as adults, they'll be bright red, green, and yellow, whereas you can see Trevor here is primarily, yeah, that's a good view of you, Trevor. She's primarily brown and yellow with a little bit of green on her. So these guys are known for being voracious eaters. They're basically a mouth with a stomach attached to it, which is really entertaining, really cool to watch, but it also presents some problems that I'll get to a little bit later. If you get one, I don't recommend getting one from a pet store. First of all, they usually miss the species. They'll have them labeled as ornate when they are Cranwelly. So unless you see one that's albino, which means it's absolutely Cranwelly because there aren't any albino ornates on the market at all, unless you see that it's an albino, you don't know what species you're getting. They constantly mislabel them because they just don't know the difference between the species, especially as babies. So that's one reason to get one from a breeder or a reptile expo. Also, a lot more colors are available if you go to one of those venues. So I'm going to put her in a little dish of lukewarm treated water to soak while I finish up the video because they don't especially like to be handled. She's especially calm for a frog, but they don't get anything out of being handled, and I don't recommend doing it unless you're, moving the frog out of the tank to do maintenance or something like that. All right, hop in there. All right, so I mentioned treated water. That's very important for these guys. You have to have treated water. I use Sea Chem Prime, which is a fish water conditioner. You can find it in the fish aisle at almost any major pet store. And what that does is it removes both the chlorine and the chloramines from the water. And that's very important. A lot of people believe that you can treat the water, or you don't have to treat the water as long as you leave it sitting out for a day or so before you use it. And that's true, the chlorine does evaporate out. Chloramines, however, do not. And almost all municipal water systems use chloramines now. So you really need to treat the water. And that goes for water you use in misting, in their water dish for soaking, to expand their substrate, any of that. It all needs to be treated. Another thing to avoid is distilled water because it has no minerals in it, and the entire skin of the frog is basically an osmotic membrane, meaning that minerals and fluids kind of transfer through it really easily, and the lack of minerals in the distilled water can do some serious harm to the frog. So don't use distilled. You can use bottled spring water. That is safe. But it's so much cheaper and easier to use, to just use your tap water and treat it with a little bit of water conditioner. And one bottle of that water conditioner lasts months. It's definitely worth it, in my opinion. So I mentioned treating your substrate with water, and that's because the substrate for these guys has to be fairly moist. So what you're looking for, and by the way, I think Eco Earth is really the only substrate for these guys, and I'll get to that in a minute. What you're looking for water content in your substrate is that when you grab a handful of it and release it, it kind of holds its shape. You can see how that's not just falling down immediately. You don't want to be able to squeeze it and just have water dripping out of it. That's too wet. That's a breeding ground for bacteria. And you don't want it too dry, because if it's too dry, the frog will think that the dry season is coming and start going underground trying to estivate, which is their version of hibernation. And you don't want that happening either. So As I said, EcoWorth is, in my opinion, really the only suitable bedding for these guys. You don't want anything chunky, no bark, nothing hard. That's serious. That's a serious hazard because not only can their sensitive skin get cut on it very easily, but it can be fatal if they eat a piece of it. Um, Sphagnum moss is another one, and that's a lot more insidious because a lot of people can look at the bark and think, well, that's not a good substrate for a frog to be on. But, the sphagnum moss seems safe. It's soft, it holds humidity well, but it's very dangerous. And the reason why is because, as I said, these guys are a mouth with a stomach attached to it. They will eat anything that moves. And if something happens to move near a piece of sphagnum moss, they're eating the sphagnum moss along with it. I've seen so many people that have problems with their frog becoming impacted because the moss, once it gets in their system, it won't break down at all. And that can cause serious intestinal blockages. The good news is that usually if you catch that, you can treat it even at home with honey soaks. So it's usually a correctable problem, but you don't want that problem to be there to begin with. So just avoid using the moss. Even if you feed your frog in a separate tank, which I honestly don't recommend, it's stressful for them. You take them out of their home and then expect them to feel comfortable enough to eat. That's 50-50 if you're even going to get your frog to eat doing that. But, I've had her lunge when she sees a reflection in the glass, when she sees me moving around feeding some of the other animals, and get a mouthful of substrate. So even if you don't feed in the tank, that doesn't mean your frog won't end up eating any substrate. Now, the EcoWorth is small enough, it's particulate enough that it can go through their system without harming them, just about 100% of the time. So it's really the bedding to use for Pacman frogs. Now, another essential piece of cage decor is the water dish. So you need a water dish that's big enough for the frog to get in and soak their entire body, and you need to change it out daily. Maybe every other day tops, but if the frog has been in it at all, you need to change it daily. They don't soak all the time, but if they decide they want to, they need to have the option. I've seen people want to put in water sources for these guys. Don't put a water source in your tank, guys, like an actual segmented area with water. They are not great swimmers. They cannot handle water that comes above the level of their chin. You're just asking for your frog to drown because you saw her. They're not built like athletes. They're built to dig a hole and sit in it. So that's just a caution for anyone who's trying to get creative and make their tank a little more appealing. Don't put a deep water source in there. Some other optional cage decor is you can use large leafy plants for the frog to hide under and feel more secure. I would recommend fake ones because, as I said, these are burrowing frogs. And they're gonna burrow and they're gonna uproot your plant and kill it. And at the very best, you're just gonna have to replant it every week or so. So I really recommend a fake one. The reason I don't have one in here for her is because I've tried it multiple times. She just will not go near them. She hates them. She just avoids that side of the tank until I take the plant out. What she really wants to be happy is substrate deep enough that she can burrow up to her eyeballs and sit there. And that's enough for her to feel secure. So it's basic substrate and cage decor. So now on to temp and humidity. So behind me, I have an excellent example of what you should never ever use to measure your temperature and humidity. These things here, they were on there when I got the tank, and I just haven't bothered trying to scrape the tape off of the back of them. They're decorations at this point, and that is all they're good for, is decoration, because they are absolutely useless. If a pet store employee tries to sell you one of these, they don't know what they're talking about. Just as a little experiment here, the silver one, that's the humidity gauge, it is reading 44% humidity. I happen to know for a fact that her tank is typically at 70 to 75% humidity. I have had the top off for a minute or two, so it might be a little bit lower than that right now, but it's definitely not at 44%. The temperature gauge reads 65. It is 80 degrees in this room. So, you can see how if you were trying to use that to get your temperature and your humidity correct, you would drown your frog and then you would cook them. So that can be very dangerous. It's very important to use proper digital temp and humidity gauges. I use a Zoomed Rectifogger, which comes with a humidity gauge. The probe just goes into the tank, and when it gets too dry, the mister turns on and it bumps it back up to the correct humidity. So I love that. It works perfectly. As far as heating goes, my reptile room, oh, by the way, for humidity, you want to keep it around 70 to 75% humidity. That's a good range for these frogs. As far as temperature goes, you want it 80 to 82 during the day and 75 to 80 at night. That temperature drop is what kind of clues them in that it's nighttime and they're going to come out and start trying to eat. So if you don't get that temperature drop in, you might have a frog that refuses to eat for you. Also, if you're trying to feed in the middle of the day, you might have a frog that refuses to eat for you. So I actually have a reptile room that has those particular ambient temperatures during the day, so I don't need a supplemental heat source in here, but most people do. And what you typically want to use is a heat pad. Now, some people use lights, and you can do that. You can make it work. I just don't like them. Also, if you have an albino frog, do not use UV light at all. That can seriously damage their eyes. But if you're using a heat pad, they're labeled under tank heaters, which is kind of a misnomer for Pacman frogs because where you want it is right here on the side of the tank. And that's because these guys thermoregulate by burrowing. They burrow deeper to get cooler. So if their heat source is coming from below, they don't understand why they're not getting cooler and they keep getting closer to the heat source, trying to burrow deeper, and it just compounds the problem. So you need to have it on the side. Also, if you're using a heat pad, I really recommend getting a thermostat because if you just plug in a heat pad and leave it unregulated, they can get up to 120 degrees fast. And that is way into the danger zone for these frogs. You don't want it getting that hot. So you need to have it regulated in some way. As far as feeding goes, they do have a reputation for being really voracious eaters, but if anything is off in their habitat, they will freak out and stop eating. That is one of the most common problems I've seen. So make sure everything in your husbandry is on point if your frog's not eating. Some common feeders are crickets, dubia roaches, and night crawlers. My personal favorite is night crawlers. If you're doing crickets and dubia roaches, you do need to gut load them, which is basically just feeding them, healthy fruits and vegetables before you give them to your frog. And for any of those, you do need to supplement. Now, for supplements, you have calcium, which I would recommend dusting twice a week. And vitamin supplements. You typically want to get the ones without phosphorus. Just look on the labeling and it should say without phosphorus on it. And for those, I would say every other feeding, dust with the vitamins. I feed my frog one night crawler every other day, and as you can see, she's perfectly fat and happy. Their metabolisms can vary greatly, so, just take into account your frog's weight and size when you're figuring out how much to feed. Babies do need to eat every day, and the vitamin supplementation is really important for young frogs because if you don't do that, they'll end up developing metabolic bone disease. And what that is, it causes their front legs to bow out, their mouth to start hanging open because they can't close it properly. If you catch it and correct it, the frog will usually live, but it's always going to be deformed. So just keep on top of supplementation if you've got a young frog. Pinky mice. A lot of people want to feed their frog mice. It's not necessary at all. And if you do that, be sure that you keep your the mice intake to no more than 1 a month. And that's because they have extremely high fat content, and that can cause liver failure if you feed too much of them, and blindness even. So definitely, be sparing with the pinkies. That's treat only. I think that's about it. Trying to think if I skipped over anything, and I don't think I have. So, like the video, subscribe if you want to see more, and leave a comment with any suggestions or anything you'd like to see discussed in a future video. Alright, say goodbye, Trevor. Oh, Trevor, come on. No, you come up here. Say goodbye, Trevor. You're about to go back into your house. Alright. Get in there. Yeah, that's where you want it to be. Alright.